and welcome to Totally Tank, the tankiest podcast in Tankville. I'm Rob, and I'm here on the 10th of the 10th with...
Hello, my name is John, and yes, I'm one of the regular co-hosts of this podcast, so hopefully most of you already heard me before. Rob, how are you?
I am well.
Okay,
this week.
Good. And we're in person. We're finally back in the pod.
Back in the room.
Yeah.
Because, as John was saying before, we are 97% first vaccination here in Canberra. How good is that, people? Leading the world.
I think there's some places with like mandatory vaccination that we're never going to beat.
Leading the world.
Yeah, 97% is pretty good in terms of, I'm sorry if we've got some anti-vaxxers in the audience, but you're nuts and you're wrong. So just get a vaccine.
Yep.
I'm loving how the Republicans in America have just figured out that it's their supporters who are dying because of this vaccine madness, and this is going to cost them elections. Anyway, let's talk about tanks.
We could stick on that topic for a long time, so let's talk about tanks.
What tank are we talking about today,
The
Rob?
M551 Sheridan.
Sheridan.
Also known as the General Sheridan is actually the proper name for it, not just the Sheridan. It's
Really?
the General Sheridan.
Wikipedia's just got Sheridan.
But it's named after General
It is named after Philip Sheridan, who was a magnificent cavalry general of the Union and really burned some slave-owning plantationers out.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
All right, so it's
Hello, Texas.
Hello, Texas.
We've had a bunch of Texas listeners in the last little while.
Hello,
Texas.
Hello, Texas. We love you. All right. Hopefully, everybody's doing fine down there and has gotten their vaccine and is wearing their masks. Look, what we're talking about today is the Sheridan, though, and it's not a tank. It is a
tank.
It is a light reconnaissance vehicle because when they needed to get the money for it, they also had the American Army had the M60 coming up for budget appropriations, and they didn't think they could get the idea of Congress to buy two developmental tanks at the same time. So they said, you know what, we'll call one an armed reconnaissance vehicle and the other one a tank. And that's how they got the Sheridan funded.
Now let's talk a little bit about what the Sheridan was supposed to be, and then we'll get into what it actually was, because the difference between the vision and the reality is where the interest in this tank lies. So it was supposed to be a parachute insertable light tank with a enormous main gun that was capable of firing anti-tank missiles. And the concept behind it was that it could move with the airborne divisions and be quickly delivered to where it needed to be. And then it's the tricky thing with light tanks in that they can't beat heavy tanks regularly, and they're not supposed to. But it would still provide enough armoured support to those airborne divisions that they would be very hard to deal with by anything less than another armoured division.
So the concept came about from the Americans wanting to have this a light tank, even though they just gotten rid of the definitions of light, medium, and heavy tanks, and they'd just gone for MBTs, and then that's why another reason why they call this a light reconnaissance vehicle, an armored reconnaissance vehicle, is they needed something that could go out there and do things. Now, the Russians had just introduced the BT-76, which carried out all these functions except for the air deployable. So it was amphibious, it had a big gun, it could carry troops, and it was fast, it was light, and it was very maneuverable. And when the Americans found out about the BT-76, they said, oh, hang on, we've got this other tank in development, the T-92, I think it was called, but it wasn't amphibious. And that was the sticking point. It had a gun, it had light armour, it was air deployable, but it wasn't amphibious without all sorts of mucking around. So they said, right, scrap that idea, build something new. And that's where the Sheridan came about, because it had to be amphibious. And because they were keeping up with the Joneses of the Russians and their BT-76, which they were then selling to any Warsaw Pact aligned country that was available. And the Americans said, well, we've got to stop, we've got to compete in that market realistically.
But the trouble, as we've kind of discussed in previous episodes on light tanks, is that there's nowhere to hide with the design. With a heavier tank, you can chuck some extra weight on and maybe it goes a little slower. Or, you can add extra armour and again it goes a little slower, and then you say, okay, we'll put a bigger engine in and it gets heavier again. And that can be a death cycle in itself. But in a light tank, you start adding the weight, and the plane can't carry it, and then it's reason to exist, or the bridges can't support it. And then its reason to exist disappears. So they're very hard to get right, and probably in some ways much harder to get right than.
You're doing a lot more with less, because the light tank still has to be mobile, so it's got to have a decent engine. It's still got to have some armor, so it's got to protect the crew. It's got to have a decent gun to be able to engage with either soft-skinned, light armored, and sometimes even heavily armored MBTs. It's got to be deployable by air and amphibious. All those things add up to a lot of capabilities that you need to try and squeeze into a very small package.
Yeah, and every time you see a failed defence project, it's because the requirements were unrealistic. And as we're going to get to, I will say that the really interesting thing about the Sheridan is that when it was used according to its design principles, it was actually extremely effective and remains a much missed capability now that it's no longer in service.
Yeah, but there was a lot of other issues with it that
absolutely
had to be dealt with over time, and Anyway, so with the history of it is from the T-92 getting scrapped, and in 1960 they decided, right, we need to start developing this new light armored reconnaissance vehicle. And eventually, come 1966, they're in the US. We're in the Vietnam War, and General Westmoreland said, "Right, I want these light tanks over here to start participating and providing that on-the-spot firepower." They didn't get there until 1969, so they were delivered to their armoured divisions, or cavalry divisions, I should say, from 1967 onwards. But they didn't actually arrive in country in Vietnam until January 1969. Within the first month of the 74 that were delivered, there were a number of issues. Within 3 months of the 74 delivered, there was some fun numbers here. 16 mechanical errors, 41 failed shot, 140 failed shells, 25 engine burnouts, lots of electrical errors on turret, and various other difficulties with finding the tanks. And that's the first 3 months. Now,
but also when it was initially deployed, I mean, we're going to get to the problems with this ammunition at significant length. Yes. Don't worry. But it also only had high explosive anti-tank rounds initially, which
that was another reason why it was delayed getting to Vietnam, is because they were wanting to get build up enough stock of the HE rounds that they could deploy it, because this 152 gun, which is what it's got, it's a huge...
You can lob a big shell, yeah.
But it's so short, and so nobody's building this sort of stuff, and so they had to start manufacturing these shells from nothing. And they didn't have enough to be able to send them over there with, because otherwise they didn't want to deploy them with just the machine guns, which understandably was a bit stupid to have a light armoured vehicle that only had machine guns on it.
Look, shall we talk now about the gun system, both in its envisagement and its reality?
Let's do that.
Okay. So, and this also, we have talked about the M60 in a previous episode, which the M60A2 Starship, I think, used the same gun system.
Yep.
Which, in one way, a parachute insertable tank that is using the same gun system as the frontline main battle tank. That's an amazing concept. But the reality of the gun system is, so it's 152 millimeter. That's the bore diameter. Gun, which can lob a big HE shell, but not an enormous amount of range, something like 800 meters tops. And for our American friends, a meter is roughly a yard. They're pretty much interchangeable at that level. And
half a mile. There you go.
Yeah, or half a mile. Yeah, and it can also fire these shillelagh missiles, which was a huge anti-tank missile, which, if it worked, was capable, even from this quite lightweight gun system, of smashing up any tank in the world. So the concept, brilliant. You can see why people went for it. But okay, now let's talk about the reality.
Let's break it down into its components and what it does and what it doesn't do.
Now for mine, the biggest mistake that they made was trying to go too early for a technology that is still not mature, which is caseless ammunition. Which is where instead of having a brass case around the propellant and the shell,
keeping it all nicely tucked in.
Keeps it all nicely tucked in and handleable. And also, and this is the thing that would come to bite this gun system enormously, when you pull the brass out of the breech, you take all the unburned residue out and you put it somewhere else. Now, you maybe have a special port that it drives out of the tank. Maybe you just drop it in the bottom of the turret and deal with it later. But it's not in the gun anymore, because one of the biggest problems they had...
It's not floating around the inside of the tank either. It's inside the casing.
Yeah, that's it. So they had all these rounds that had their propellant sitting around, and if anything burning or exploding came in contact with them, that was an enormous risk to everyone inside the tank. So ammunition stowage has become a lot more volatile by going with caseless.
Mm-hmm.
But also because...
with limited space inside the turret, there is ammunition stored everywhere.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it's a 4-man light tank, so it's a lot of people crammed into a very small area.
Yep.
So the problem that they had was that when you fire a gun, it doesn't actually restore itself on its own to pristine cleanness, and in fact you've got lots of little bits of partially burnt propellant.
Which is back in the old days they used to get
swab it out.
Yeah, get a man with a wet rag to shove his wet pole rag down the barrel and swab it out and clean it up and make sure nothing's going to go boom when they shove the cartridge bag back down there.
Yeah, and through an awful lot of very dangerous and a lot of people getting injured, they realised that this system needed a better way of cleaning the bore, and they tried 2 different bore evacuation systems with blasting pressurised air through the barrel to clean it out, which, okay, fine, that eventually they got a solution. But then they had the problem that because this was sort of a half-baked, half-finished design that should never have been released in the field for actual soldiers to use, if you had been firing the Shillelagh missile and you failed to change the switches on the gun system, and this is meant to be used by people in combat who are not necessarily...
It could be nighttime, it could be all sorts of...
Yeah, or they're having to move quickly, they're under a lot of stress, and so if they fail to flick the switch, then there are little knobs still in the breech that will tear the casing off the shell and cover the inside of the turret with propellant.
Which it probably already is because...
all the other rounds bouncing around.
Yeah, the propellant bags on the end of the rounds were susceptible to humidity and heat, and so they would split open, and so you get loose propellant just sitting in the bottom of the turret anyway. So you don't want to be a smoker around these things.
Certainly not in the turret.
Yeah, nowhere near them. And there's other issues that were reported about some of the hydraulic fluids. Lines would be sitting underneath the turret basket as well, and they'd get caught up, and then suddenly you'd be leaking flammable fluids.
I believe that was the system for... it was a hydraulic system to arrest the breech when it fired. And yeah, it could easily burst open, and they called it cherry pipping because
that was another one.
Oh, another one. Okay.
Yeah, no, this is just wires, just things getting caught under the turret as it moved around.
Which is a basic requirement of a tank to not happen.
Yeah, but the cherry pipping was another one where, as you fired the rounds, there was the sealants. Usually, to have a brushless rubber seal around the hydraulic systems that would just expand and contract as required as the pressure came in from the gun going off. But this one had some sort of screw top release valve, and when you fired the main gun, it would be couldn't compensate for that, and this pink fluid would just get sprayed all around the inside of the tank, and of course that was highly flammable as well. So you have lots of various flammable things sitting inside this turret and
But
just going.
when your troops have even got a name for it, calling it cherry pipping, it's happened so often. And also, I mean, you're meant to pass inspection at some point as well. And if you're covered in weird fluids, that I don't imagine that goes down well when General Westmoreland comes to have a look at you. So in so many ways, the good concepts just weren't finished when this tank was put into service.
No, and look, and it was when I was saying before about it was deployed in January 1969. They deployed it when they were deployed into the field. Out with them came the factory representatives, the engineers, and so forth, so they could see these things, how they went in combat, in order to evaluate and make changes for the next generation of these tanks. And it was a case of, well, shouldn't you be doing that before you deploy them and before you give them and put them in harm's way, is figuring out what things are going to go wrong?
Look, anytime the sales reps are actually deployed in the field with the troops, things have gone horribly wrong, because their involvement with the tank's deployment should really end at the point that it's handed over with the keys.
I mean, with the costs of it all, the $1.3 billion cost. Now, I don't know what that is for money at that time, but there was a bit of brouhaha about how the US Army was trying to hide the costs and didn't want them displayed, and eventually it came out that those are the costs, and everybody was a bit shocked by how much they were going for. So, I don't know. 1.3 billion sounds a pretty good deal these days, doesn't it, John?
Yeah, well, I mean, at the time, these were $300,000 tanks, and particularly before they got the ammunition to make them useful, there was concern that they were going to have a $300,000 machine gun platform. And, in today's money, a $300,000 machine gun platform seems like a very cheap machine gun platform.
Yeah, that's
right. It's just so frustrating. And, in this era, I read a study about how the F-111 basically murdered pilots in its early development, and that plane became a very good plane.
Yeah, it took 10 to 15 years of a lot of work to reach that point.
But General Dynamics was still selling it for millions of dollars, even though it wasn't fit for service and was highly lethal because of failures in their design and manufacture. And I think, you're of literally the same vintage as I am. Both our fathers lost friends to these faulty systems. And in some levels, it's inexcusable. In previous eras, they would have had those executives' heads on sticks. And the most annoying thing about the Sheridan is how it was actually very good when the concept was actually finally delivered.
Yeah, yeah.
Go on.
It was, to go into some of the specs of the tanks, it was about 17 old school tons, or 15 or 16 metric tons. It was an air deployable. It had an NBCD system. It was because it was designed for fighting the Cold War. 300 horsepower diesel engine.
And I've got to say, 300 horsepower on a 15-ish ton tank, that's a lot of power in a light tank.
Well, as I say, it could do 70 k's an hour across on road and about 560 k range, so pretty good.
Yeah.
Aluminium hull, so again, you've got a lot of issues there, but that does save you a lot of weight. Steel turret.
I get slightly nervous with the idea of putting a steel turret on an aluminium hull. I really think, in general design terms, engineering terms, you want the heavy thing down low and the light thing up high.
Well, it does produce some nice photos of them after they've been cooked up, of just having the turrets sticking up out of this puddle.
Unmelted, a puddle of aluminium. Yeah.
So there's supposedly quite a number of photos of those in Vietnam. Now, speaking more again about its deployment in Vietnam, they didn't do... They lost 5 in a day to RPG fire, and then they lost another 3 in a day to mines while doing a river fording. It's a case of, when else do you hear about losing 5 tanks in a day? I mean, yes, it's a light armoured reconnaissance vehicle, but it's being used.
But Vietnam was such an appalling misuse of this vehicle in so many ways. And I get why they were like, oh, quick, get it out here. And also the defence contractors just like, that's where the conflict is. That's where we want our product. But, this is a tank that is has been built entirely around being air deployable and going in fast and with the airborne troops, and to then just have it trundling out from the forward operating base every day, trundling over known routes, which are, why the enemy can mine them. I believe there were cases as well when heavy machine gun fire was penetrating the hull, which did not impress the crew at all.
No,
and it was supposed to be able to keep out machine gun fire. I think up to 20mm it was supposed to be able to.
No, it was only up to 12, only up to 50 cal, but the MVA were using 14.7 Russian various guns, so...
Yeah. And say what you like about the Russians, but, I mean, even the Germans in World War II admitted that the armour penetration of Russian guns was the best in the business. Yeah.
Look, there's a number of issues with them. They had a number of good things about them in Vietnam. Being light, they could go through the mud. They could...
Mud and bridges, yeah.
Yeah, mud and bridges where they were. They didn't use the amphibious capabilities. They did a lot of river fording.
When we see amphibious...
we're talking about actually floating through the water rather than just crossing a shallow...
Did they have to put silly skirts around the side, though?
They did find the silly skirts were actually good at setting off the RPG rounds. So they would raise those sometimes just if they were worried about it, because the shaped charge of the RPG round would go off when they hit those.
Good old slatted armour.
Yeah, pretty much. Again, it wasn't designed for hot and humid conditions, and so they...
Oh, it was hell to be in, from what I've heard. Yeah,
no, it was designed for Northern Europe. It was very hot, and the crew and the caseless rounds did not enjoy being in the humid environment either, because they would swell. As soon as they got any moisture in them, they would swell, and then they would split, and then you'd have propellant all around the place.
Look, my uncle, who was a logistician for the British Army for many years. I remember in the 90s I got very excited about caseless ammunition because it seemed like the science fiction way of the future, and authors like William Gibson were writing stories in which caseless submachine guns featured heavily, and I mentioned this to my uncle and he was like, no, it's the pits. you can't store it very long, and vulnerable to humidity, all the things we're talking about. I remember he just gave me this litany of why caseless was not the way of the future at all, and it could still be that a caseless propellant that has all the properties it needs to be stable and, what's the phrase, insensitive. I love the idea of insensitive munition. Could come about, but at the moment, I still don't think it really exists. Although the British Ajax, which is we've
talked about before.
We've talked about how flawed that is, but that's trying to use a caseless 40mm system. For the whole point of caseless, though, is it lets you do really high rate of fire because you don't have to eject the casings from your system. But for a tank gun, that's kind of neither here nor there. You've still got to open the breech and stick the next one in.
Speaking of rate of fire, it had a rate of fire of 2.
Yeah, well, it was an enormous round in a very small turret.
And there were a number of steps that the gunner and loader all had to go through in order to load this.
And these big flippy switches that all had to be in the right settings, or the system would not function.
Yep. And the turret had to be powered on 20 seconds before you went into combat, because otherwise you didn't have the turret powered on all the time. It was
but this is the stuff that drives me wild, these design flaws that someone in head office, this was...
Cadillac?
No, it was General Motors, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Which is Cadillac, but yeah.
Yep.
Someone in General Motors like, we'll just, put it on the troops to figure out, to hit the right buttons at the right time. And it is asking too much of people in combat to keep hitting switches in the right order at the right time to make up for your design failures.
That's the point of training, and I'll get on to some of the training aspects a bit later. But,
particularly with a conscript army, I mean, you've really got to be... And everything that you're doing that puts more demand on the operators is removing capability that the operators could be devoting that attention to.
Yep.
Humans have limited capacity. And this tank just kept asking more and more of the operators than they could deliver.
Yeah. It had 4 crew, 3 in the turret, and the driver central to the hull. And
which, frankly, was too many for a light tank. They should have done with this. Get rid of the caseless, put an autoloader in.
Americans didn't do autoloaders. So.
Yeah. But for a light tank, it's asking a lot to lug 4 dudes around.
Yeah, but you also had to load everything via the turret, so it's a lot of loading.
Not like the S-Tank. I mean, the S-Tank was made 10 years before this thing and much easier to reload.
Oh, God, yeah. Whereas this, you're loading your missiles. Your missiles go...
Missiles have to go nose down, and missiles go nose up. Okay. It was different.
The missiles, they get carried sideways and get loaded and stored one direction. I can't remember which. Whereas
Again, you're asking too much of the operators.
The rounds had to be loaded, stored and loaded, carried nose down so that the
propellant didn't fall off. Yeah,
out of its little rubber asbestos bag that was strapped onto the outside so it didn't spread everywhere.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking we're going to draw a line under this with Vietnam service, and then come back and talk some more about post-Vietnam. So,
all right. So let's go get a beer.
We were out of beer, and that's the biggest problem going on here.
Yeah.
We'll be back to... Is there more you want to talk about Vietnam, or do you want to do that after?
I'm sure I'll come back with something, but that's all right. We'll keep going.
All right. Okay, then. Look, we've got a special guest. This is the first time we've ever interviewed a tank. So
that's one way of putting it.
We're just going to play that now. Here's an interview with the Sheridan. Okay, folks. Joining me today is a very special guest. Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Sheridan.
And Sheridan, when did you find out that you were in fact a tank?
On our first date.
And how did that go down?
It was quite surprising. It was a little confronting. I've had to come to terms with my own identity, having been changed significantly from the age of about 35.
So, now, I let's just be clear for everyone. Sheridan here is my partner. We live together. And so on her first date, I think I said, did you know you were named after a tank?
You did. And I said, no, I had no idea. And, obviously people have told me I'm named after sheets, incorrectly told me I'm named after hotels. But I had never been aware that I was a tank.
Right. Or the US Civil War general.
Well, Sheridan is a very common last name, but not that specifically, but that wouldn't have surprised me as much.
Right, and would you recommend to other dudes on first dates to let the women they're going out with that they are named after a tank?
I would say yes. I mean, it did impress me in that I was like, wow, this guy knows something that no one in my entire life has ever pointed out to me, even though it has obviously a very strong connection to my name.
And some of the headlines about Sheridan, if you Google Sheridan, it's mired in despair and death trap and bogged down in Vietnam. Somehow you've managed to avoid all of that?
Well, this is why I think I was so impressed by you, is that I've obviously Googled myself before and it has never come up. So you knew more about me than Google.
Okay, all right. And, how has your life changed now that you are aware that you are a tank?
I think I was probably more excited when I found out that it was a parachute insertable tank.
That's correct, yep.
Because I didn't think tanks could fly. And that's kind of cool.
They're not very good at it. Yeah.
Yeah, you keep telling me that. I've not done any of my own research to affirm whether that's true or not.
Sure, but I mean, it's a small tank with a packing a heavy punch. Do you feel that suits you?
I mean, I am pretty short.
Yeah.
Increasingly wider, so probably more tank-like in my physical dimensions as I age. So yeah, maybe I'm turning into the tank.
Wow.
I don't like heights though, so I don't think the parachuting's gonna fly.
It's only brief moments of excitement when it's parachuting, and that it doesn't have to fight in the air.
Oh, so it doesn't shoot in the air?
No.
Oh, that's a bit disappointing.
That's something they should fix?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Sheridan. This is the first time we have interviewed an actual tank in this podcast, so much appreciated. Now, welcome back from that. I hope that you found that amusing and not self-indulgent. And let's talk more about the Sheridan. Actually, Rob, something I wanted to ask about, or talk about. the concept with the parachute insertability.
Yes.
Now, after a number of spectacular disasters in training, it was decided that the tank would never be airdropped with a crew inside.
They actually tried that?
No, not with the crew inside, but after a
Okay.
number of airdrops,
Right.
there were enough pancaked craters that they realised that the
So you had two types. So you had the low velocity airdrop, which was pushing out of the back of any sort of cargo plane, and then you had which is called the LVAD, and then you had the LAPES, which was the low altitude parachute extraction system, where they basically C-130 flies low over a stretch of ground, and they push out of the back, and it skids to a stop, all palletized up, and hopefully it'll keep on going.
Yeah, and it worked reasonably well, but it failed often enough that, as I said, the decision, the move was always that the tank was dropped and then the crew were dropped, and here's the bit where I find again the concept doesn't match up with reality, because most large scale drops have to be done at night, because if you do it in the daytime against any
People get
sort of adversary, they'll just shoot them all, right? So you land in the dark in terrain that is not well known to you, and then you have to go find your tank.
Yep. You start pressing that button and wait for the thing to go beep beep.
Yeah, and not only that, then let's say, you hike for, could be an hour, hopefully in the right direction, to the place you last saw where the tank was going. And you come across the clearing. Hopefully the tank's in a clearing, not stuck halfway up a tree.
Well, 17 tons, most trees won't hold 17 tons.
Well, yeah, but, it might knock down a bunch of trees and be sort of perched on top of them. I mean, you certainly would hope that it wasn't landed anywhere near trees or there's going to be problems with getting it moving. So you come to the clearing, and there's your tank, and it's been hours since it was dropped. It would be a very nerve-wracking moment approaching that vehicle when the enemy may or may not have, or even be inside it already.
Yeah, usually you would drop your troops first, let them get on the ground. Then, as a second sortie, you'd send over your tanks and drop them out the back. And so the troops on the ground are watching where they're coming down.
Yeah, but I mean, in Panama, they dropped them all at the same time.
I bet the tanks came down slightly after
Yeah.
the troops hit the ground.
Sure, okay, but anyway, these things aren't precise sciences at all, although the low altitude airdrop where it sort of skids out the back is pretty much where you want it to be, but very limited number of sites you can do that.
However, that was so I read some good some fun stuff all about that. So the loadies who sit in the back of the C-130, so your Hercules, basically everybody's got them, so it fits in the back of there, so you're great.
It was a design requirement of this tank that it fit in a Hercules, yeah.
All right, so with the LAPES, with your low altitude parachute extraction system, very dangerous for the load crew. Very highly specialised activity, and so you had to be recertified every year to do that. So much more difficult and much more dangerous for all around, for the plane, for the loadies, for everything else. Whereas your low velocity airdrop, where you just push it out the back, let the 7 cargo parachutes pop open. Much safer for everybody. Didn't have to be specialised load masters.
But the tank could come down anywhere.
Yeah, but you didn't have to be specialised load masters. There was very little danger for them. There was just another cargo load that they were pushing out the back. And so that becomes a bit of a point of difference of, how are we going to do this? Well, we're pushing people out the back of these planes, and it could come out of any cargo plane. It didn't have to be a C-130, so it could be a C-5, C-17, and whatever else. So, again, much less specialised, but still maintaining the capability that you want, because you've already dropped your troops from another plane. They've landed, and then you come along and you drop this one, so you can watch that coming down. And, so while it was air droppable, and did happen, as you say, did happen in Panama, it wasn't... There were considerations to what you were doing and whether or not you would want to do the LAPES.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing with the certification is, as we both know, you say, you must be certified in a year. When the real push is on and the thing has to go, people who aren't certified are still going to have to do it.
Yeah.
And yes, it's extremely dangerous, and that becomes... part of how you have to think about these things, and sadly, too often with this vehicle, no one was actually thinking it all the way through.
I want to go on to an Australian connection for this tank.
Yes.
So in 67 and 68, the Australians said, you know what? We're looking for a new light tank. Can we borrow?
Because we just created some cavalry regiments.
We just created some cavalry regiments. So could we borrow some and have a look and see how we go? And we might buy some off of you because being the good little American ally that we are, that we'll happily buy whatever they're selling. And we took them up to Innisfail and around Tully and North Queensland in the jungle because it was the middle of the start of the Vietnam War for us, I guess. And we found all the issues that we've just been talking about with the ammo and the caseless ammunition and the turrets and everything.
The Australian evaluators handed them back saying that ammunition is no good.
We're not doing this. So for our cavalry units, they took the turret off the Saladin and stuck it on top of an M113 and said, yep, that's now our reconnaissance vehicle. Away we go. So we've got a little 76mm gun on top of an M113 and we go from there.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally a reconnaissance vehicle should never be spec'd for tank combat. You know, that you just shouldn't even be encouraging them to try and engage main battle tanks.
Yeah, you should be calling in airstrikes.
Yeah,
but
just report the position and get out.
They've got to have the capability, though. It's what everybody says. Anyway.
Yeah, but I mean, it's funny because we see so many of these projects come a cropper by trying to get too big a gun into a vehicle that's main weapon is meant to be its radio.
Yep.
And I get that in armies everyone wants the biggest, shootiest gun possible, but a little more careful thinking about these things would probably help. Also, while we're on the subject of the failings of the gun, which we've talked about so much, but we're going to talk about some more, it had a dead zone.
Between 800 and 1,000. So theoretically, the Shillelagh missile had a engagement. It would start engaging and be active, and the warhead active from about 80 meters. Realistically, we're told that was actually 1,000 meters, and so the main gun fired out to 800. The Shillelagh didn't actually arm until 1,000, and then would fire and would be active from 1,000 to 3,000. In that 200 meter gap, you had no capability of taking on enemy armor or positions. And yeah, you're right, they had the capability gap there.
It seems like madness that any finished weapon system entering service would have 200 meters is a significant chunk of land. And if the enemy's aware of this gap, and you can assume for something like this, the enemy will be aware of it. Quick, just drive into the bit it can't shoot at us.
Yep. And that's all interesting stuff, is because it didn't fire on the move. The driver had to pull up into a position and stop to fire. The other thing with the Shillelagh is that once you fired, you've got to stay in that one position and watch it.
And guide it in.
And watch it scoot along for whatever distance. And all that time, the enemy might say, oh, somebody's just fired at us from over there. I'm going to turn my turret around. And at the time that missile has come driving in at a reasonable clip, but there's still a chance for them to fire back, and you're sitting there having to guide your missile in on the target.
And it's an infrared data link.
Yep.
Which, magnesium flares can may or may not.
Not only that, John. If the sun was behind the tank,
target,
behind the Sheridan, because it's
the sensor on the missile was looking backwards.
Yes, it couldn't figure out where it was going. So there was they can only fire the missile if the sun wasn't within 40 degrees of the rear of the tank or something like that, and saying because then it would lose lock and you're just firing blind then.
And then you've got the issue that the gun can't actually be fired sideways without flipping the tank over. Yeah. At which point, why have a turret? What's the point in your steel turret on your aluminium hull?
Because if you've seen this thing firing, when it fires a heat round, it's always going to be directly to the frontal arc, and it lifts up a long way. The front two road wheels come off the turf, and you can imagine if it turned the turret sideways and then tried to fire a heat round, it would flip the thing. Not that we saw any of that, but it just looks you wouldn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, let's remember that the Striker mobile gun system that is in service today, if the enormous gun is turned sideways on that wheeled vehicle and they go around a corner fast, will also flip over. So this is not a problem that has been solved in the interim. I think, Rob, this might now be the moment.
Oh no, you've got to talk about more about the gun.
You want to talk more about the gun?
Yeah,
Okay.
if you fired the main gun too many rounds, so about 50 rounds, it would crack. The barrel would crack.
Right. Okay.
So you've only
This is assuming that you haven't already blown yourself up with the hot fragments in the thing when you shove the next round in, right?
Yes, all those things. If you've actually gotten through the point of firing, surviving the 49 rounds.
And if you've got all the twiddly dip switches in the right position for the firing that you're trying to do.
Now, for those who haven't seen it, there is a lovely little training video from the US from 1969 about crew using it. And in it, the gunner comes along and goes up to say that the gun is loaded. The loader says up. The gunner says identify, saying that they've sighted the target and laid the gun on target. And then they say on the way. Well, it means they're about to pull the trigger, and so everybody needs to brace inside the tank because it's about to jump all around the place. And then they say target, means they've actually hit it. Now, with bracing themselves, if the commander was out standing in his turret, in his cupola.
Mm-hmm. And there was an enormous 50 caliber gun mount on the top of the turret as well, which he's supposed to use at times in theory.
In theory, yep. He did have a good chance of breaking his ribs if he wasn't braced well enough, because he'd be thrown around the inside, in the cupola. And so, again, there's so many different little issues of going on. And so, yes, they did. They started out without a gun shield on the 50 cal for the commander. After in Vietnam, they figured out, we better put a gun shield on it, and they provided some better capability.
Why make it too easy for the enemy to murder your tank commanders?
Well, if the loader's sitting outside the tank because it's too hot in there anyway. So.
Yeah. Sometimes you wonder how the Americans could have lost the Vietnam. Well, not just the Americans. We lost the Vietnam War with them.
We were there too.
How did we lose the Vietnam War? And it's like, well, because we let defense companies sell substandard equipment to us that we then forced our soldiers, usually conscripts, to
they didn't have
use in a pointless war.
They didn't have the political will for what they were trying to do.
Well, there's that as well.
Yeah. Anyway, once again, we get into the politics, all sorts of fun stuff. But we won't, because we're talking here to talk about tanks.
Yes.
All right, so other things about this tank.
Okay.
I like the doctrine that was deployed, because it was a Cav unit in Vietnam. It's cavalry tank. It usually the troops liked it because it would be embedded with the cavalry forces, and so they had infantry, basically dismounted infantry that would go along with them. And it would be dedicated.
So they're trying to go along with the M113s covering the infantry, and the Sheridans to do fire support.
You'd have the cavalry. You'd have the Sheridans. You'd have the M113s without dedicated infantry with them, and then an infantry unit would come along and mount into the M113s, and then they would drive forward. And so when the infantry got out, they would have the Sheridans with them, and so they'd have some direct fire combat support in location with them to provide direct fire support whatever they were doing. Whereas the usual infantry, they would go in by themselves, and so there were no tanks or anything else with them. It was only the mechanized infantry who had actual tank battalions and platoons would actually deploy with them. And so they were mechanized infantry who would be deployed with their M113s. Now, they were few and far between, whereas the general infantry could be thrown into the back of a cavalry M113 and taken forward, and they would come out and have these Sheridans with them. So they quite enjoyed having a small tank going along with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And in particular, later in the war, when they had the beehive and canister rounds available for the M113, you've got this enormous bore cannon, 152 millimeters.
Clearing a nice big swathe of jungle with...
when we say canister, we're basically talking about something equivalent to a shotgun cartridge, just firing a ton of pellets. And
10,000 flechettes.
Yeah, and beehive... the beehive's the flechette version versus canister, just firing ball bearings. But yeah, it's basically firing a lot of little things very fast. It can literally clear jungle. Defoliate.
And you don't need to fire them often or fast. It's a case of, right, we need some visibility into this area because there's some dead ground in there.
Or just the enemy's there.
Yeah,
you know?
well, because we're worried the enemy's there. Bring the Sheridan up, fire one round, bang, clear the area, and say, yep, the enemy can no longer have a covered approach from that area. So it was very useful for that, and the troops on the ground appreciated it for that reason. So it was, again, there was a lot of support for it from those around it and those who were supported by it. The people who drove it, yeah, there are yes and no's. But at the higher levels, it wasn't well regarded because it had such a high casualty rate.
Yeah,
and that reported badly.
Which is where this is the problem with having a tank that is designed for air mobile warfare being just used to support grunts on the ground in a very static war. And this is where light tanks often get criticised for their survivability issues, but that's because they're getting used like main battle tanks, and they're not. And anytime you try and use them like what they're not, you get the same problem with battle cruisers in for the British, which
fighting in the line.
Yeah, for fighting in the line and blowing up, and people being surprised when they're used in a completely inappropriate way that they don't perform. Having said that, as we've discussed, there are design issues in the Sheridan that were disgraceful in and of themselves, aside from that. But there is also just the issue that it was not designed to be an infantry tank, but it was used as one.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move on from Vietnam because it did have a much greater lifespan than that war. So there was 1662 built from 69 till, and it was in service from 69 till 97.
Because when used according to its doctrine, it was and remains indispensable.
So it was built from the production run was from 66 to 1970. As I said, there were 1660 built of them. They were designed for Northern Europe, and they were deployed in Germany. West Germany and South Korea. So both of those places besides Vietnam. And later on, the other two activities that undertook was in Panama and ousting Noriega, and then in the first Gulf War in 91, they got very quickly deployed into Saudi Arabia. And
the importance of that Gulf War deployment shouldn't be understated, because without the Sheridans and the fact that they could be deployed by air, admittedly they didn't need the parachute insertion, they just needed a tank that they could fly to where it needed to be and trundle out from an airfield. If not for that, then the 82nd Airborne would have been sitting there with no armoured support whatsoever.
Now, we're waiting for the build-up to happen, but you're right, is that they got deployed there quickly and fast, and they would have been just standing around waiting, sitting in their Humvees saying, well, we've got nothing to take on any T-55s or
T-72s.
And T-72s that might come rolling over the hill in Saudi Arabia.
And if the Sheridans had not been there, it might well have made sense for Saddam Hussein and the Iraqis to just roll over the top of those forward deployed American forces.
Now, after the American forces were deployed for Cold War strategic positioning, up till that point, it was only after Cold War had finished, the Soviet Union collapsed, and this was the next conflict after that they started deploying their Marine expeditionary units around the world with tanks and everything else already deployed around the place. So,
but even from Diego Garcia, it's still many days before the tanks arrive. Whereas if the C-17 can, C-17 I believe can carry multiple Sheridans.
Probably,
but yeah, or the C-5s, or even just. C-130 Hercules are ubiquitous and common, and the fact that they can deploy one of these tanks still gives you a mobility, and the Sheridan was enough of a tank that an enemy force would need to think very carefully about how it was going to deal with it.
And they did manage to fire 6 Shillelagh missiles in Gulf War 1. Of the 88,000 missiles produced, 6 were fired in anger.
Well, at least it actually got to get used, because, I mean, One thing we haven't mentioned yet in this episode was one of the biggest problems with the Shillelagh was that being in the turret when the main gun was fired would break the fragile electronics of the Shillelagh.
Yes. So every day the gunner would have to go through a check process, and loader would have to go through a check process to make sure all the electrical systems were working and in place, and flick little switches and wait and make sure all the connections were happening and all the fuses are in the right place, because it had been built in a time where there was no electronics, no transistors. It was all electricals. Once the main gun was fired, those all got knocked out slightly out of whack, and so the missile system wouldn't actually engage correctly, and the little light would stay red and not turn to green, and therefore you could not fire a missile. Yeah. Now, I mean, a couple of things on that. One is that, in theory, if you're fighting, massive tank battle in Fulda Gap, well, you fire your shillelaghs first before the enemy closes, and then you're firing the other rounds. So, in that theoretical space, this isn't a huge limitation. But it's good because the shillelagh did have outrange any of the expected Russian armour at that point. Except for the Russian armour that had its own anti-tank missiles. But yeah, and the Russians don't seem to have had the same problems with firing anti-tank missiles out of their cannons that the Americans... I mean, this was a huge failed project. I mean, literally the American main battle tank, the M60A2, was meant to be built around this system and had to reverse course on that because it didn't work the way it was supposed to. But the other thing I was thinking was that if I was a tank crew member, I'd quite like spending 4 hours every morning with my multimeter recalibrating the missiles. That, compared to the other things that I might be asked to do, you're meant to put in 8 hours work a day, and compared to digging holes or tramping around on foot waiting to set off a mine, playing around sorting the missiles out seems like a lovely way to spend your day. As long as you're not a smoker. Well, yes. There is that. I think, Rob, it is definitely time now for... Beer review! All right. What are we drinking today, John? Well, you brought this, Rob. So, it is a California IPA from Sierra Nevada Company. Yes. Citrusy and sessionable ale. It's definitely fruity, that's for sure. Mm-hmm. Family owned, operated, and argued over. That's a blurb off the can. That's the blurb off the can. All right, hang on. Here's the sound of it. Now, Sierra Nevada is one of the biggest independent breweries in the world, and our American audience will know them extremely well. But for everyone else, we'll continue talking. I have got 2 stories about Sierra Nevada I would like to tell. How many have you already told on this podcast? None. Oh, are you sure? Yeah. Oh, I think you should listen to them again. Yeah. So one of them is that my friend Tom, who runs a small brewery in Quincy, California, had a fire in his brew house and lost all his equipment. And Sierra Nevada have loaned him, and he's now had it for, I think, something like 18 months, their mobile brew house. So his whole business... Pretty sure you've told the story already. Is totally surviving on Sierra Nevada. And the other one... Not everyone listens to every podcast, Rob. They should. Why don't you bring a different beer then? And I'll tell a story about a different brewery. And the other one is simply that at a brewing conference a few years ago, I met a retiring maltster for the Briesse company. And these are the guys who treat the grain so it can be used in brewing. And his big story was that in the 1980s, I think... they received an order for a single sack, which is 25 kilograms of malted grain, and they stood around staring at each other in this order because at that point Briesse had never shipped anything less than a rail car. So they had to go and buy a sack to put this 25 kilos in. But since then, Sierra Nevada's really come on, and so the sack was for Sierra Nevada, was it? There you go. Yes. I said Sierra Nevada orders it. But anyway, it's a 4.2 can of 355 mils. Very blue and flowery, fruity looking. This American craft beer is a living product, best stored cold and enjoyed when fresh. used before 22/12/2106. That's a fair way off, so it might not be as that's just probably 21. So there you go.
Yes. Interestingly, this one actually has printed on the can the importer's details. Normally that's just done with the labels. So they have they've canned this in California specifically for the Australian market, which is nice to know. So that's phoenixbeers.com.au. This is...
Yeah, it's not WA. It'll be what? WA would be Wisconsin over there?
Washington State?
Maybe, yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about the beer. Lovely fluffy white head. Quite nice. I mean, it just looks like beer.
It does.
There's nothing else going on there on appearance. It's got a huge floral nose. Enormous floral nose. It's a little bit like how people who read Lord of the Rings today say, oh, these concepts are so boring and derivative, without realising that everyone else has been boring and derivative, reiterating what was in Lord of the Rings that was original and new at the time. And similarly, this beer tastes like every other craft pale ale, but the thing you need to understand is that Sierra Nevada were the company that did this first.
Right.
So it tastes like an extremely floral pale ale with all those big... There's a bit of melon going on there, I reckon. Big fruity notes. They call this sessionable. For me, it's frankly a little on the perfumey side to be truly sessionable.
Yep.
And it's just a flavour profile that A has been done to death, and B, I'm thoroughly enjoying having one or two of them, but I probably wouldn't thoroughly enjoy smashing through, 8 or 9.
Yeah, you'd be a bit floraled out by the end.
Yeah. But, like I said, credit where it's due to the originators of the trend, and this is it.
There you go. And the Sheridans were also deployed in Fort Benning, I think it was, in California. There you go.
You're talking about the training use?
Probably.
You just can't wait to get back to the tanks, can you, Rob?
No, I can't.
Okay, all right. So
so we'll go, yes.
Back to tanks, yes.
Back to tanks.
Fort Benning, where for a while, I believe it was the only tank that's ever been used as the Op-4 and the training force.
Possibly.
Because they used to dress Sheridans up as various Russian tanks. Because it had power to burn as as we've said, a 15-ish ton tank with 300 horsepower. So they could put all sorts of cladding on the outside and make it look like different Russian tanks. And also the fact that it was relatively small is in keeping with the Russians, who don't like their tanks enormous and porky the way
high profile and everything else. But as a training aid, let's go into that. As a training aid vehicle, it was operated by non-tankers, and so that brought about its own issues as well. And that non-tankers didn't know all the tips and tricks for making sure the pink juice got sprayed around the inside, and other bits and pieces of trying to keep this thing running correctly and safely. And there were, and again, a number of issues and possibly training deaths associated with the Sheridan for what it was doing there in Fort Benning and other places. So it's not the safest tank.
No, but the safety problems were it was designed for incredibly dangerous use, as in being shot at the back of planes flying low and. I mean, just to see 130 flying 50 meters over the ground is a dangerous activity in itself. To then shoot a tank out the back of it, because let's think about it. If you're flying low and you lose 15 tons of mass from your plane, the plane is going to move in the air. That's
a really good point. Yeah, the poor old pilots needs to adjust for that pretty quickly.
At least what it'll probably do is go up, which is better than going down. But
there's still a massive change in acceleration and velocity or direction or whatever.
Yeah.
Is it physics you want to talk about?
Yeah,
I'm not smart enough for that sort of stuff. But
it's just dangerous stuff. And everything that the Sheridan was built for was dangerous. And then we have, as we've talked about, these deeply flawed design decisions that only could really work in ideal conditions for a tank designed to operate in non-ideal conditions, which is just annoying and irritating.
Other fun bits and pieces, the transmission was weak for the weight-to-power ratio, so the drivers had to be very careful.
Putting the load on the crew.
And the other part was most of the tank drivers had been trained on M60s and M48s. We didn't have to be careful with the transmission, and they just worked that clutch like nothing else, and suddenly, it's broken.
Let's say something nice about it, though. Almost never through a track.
No, it was very good on the tracks. Mm-hmm. Again, being light, it was...
Get less stress.
Much less stress. Let's see, what else we got? Turret electricals. The coax fire, the designed to fire the coax in 20 to 25 round bursts. There you go. It's a fun little bit of information for you.
Again, putting the load on the crew to count their rounds.
That was just training. That's how you.
It's good doctrine to not
sort of
blaze away. But no,
yeah. But okay. For those who didn't know, I don't think we've mentioned it yet. There was a 7.62 coax machine gun in the turret.
That's on the main gunner to fire.
Yes, the loader still maintains he would flick his switch to the coax. Another point on the switchboard that he had to flick to.
Another one of all the array
dials.
of little
the
dip
same
switches.
Same dial. It's just had to flick to, so you couldn't be firing you can't be firing the coax and the main gun at the same time. But you can fire the coax on the move, which you couldn't do with the main gun.
Right. Okay. Well, that's important to know. Should we ever be driving a Sheridan? There are a few of them on the second-hand market, so it's not as silly as it sounds.
And I'm a bit disappointed that we didn't, of these, as I said, 1,600 that were built, all the examples of them seem to be in the US or one or two in Canada. They haven't made it any further than, because they had no external sales of the Sheridan. Nobody else.
But the S-Tank had no external sales, and they sent it everywhere. Everyone who wanted one.
Yeah, what they. They weren't as forward thinking as the Swedes, okay? But so nobody else, it was an American-only tank, so nobody else bought it. Everybody had a look at it and said, yeah, no, not for us. But so it has only ended up in museums in the US and Canada. Others of them, though, they just threw them off the back of a ship and made some artificial reefs, I'm assuming, off California, because the other place they were deployed was in Fort Knox in Kentucky, which doesn't have a coastline.
Not so many reefs in Kentucky. Yeah.
As far as I'm aware.
Some big rivers, mind you. But, yeah, so... it's a weird way to end a tank's life as well, saying, let's make you a dive wreck. But, I mean, I'd definitely like to dive that way.
That's exactly right. It would be pretty cool to be diving down on and see having a look at it.
Hopefully they took all the anti-fouling paint and horrible things like that out of it. Cool. All right, we're coming up on the hour mark, Rob. Is there more you'd like to say about the show?
Right, with Panama, so of the 14 that were air deployed, 2 broke on landing.
Which is not bad in airdrop terms. I mean,
four were landed
your
on
troops generally don't, they break their legs at that kind of rate. So,
so 4 were flown in, 10 were airdropped, and 2 of those landed in a swamp. Basically, they couldn't get them out, so they said, right, just blow up in place type thing. So,
which we can be blasé about, but if you were the guys, because when you do that drop, particularly in Panama, where it was an invasion right on the go, at the time you don't know if it's succeeding or failing, and you're the tank crew and you can't get your tank out of the swamp, it's a bad night.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not a fun activity. It's like the guys storming the beaches and having the camera crews right in their faces.
Yeah.
But they didn't like it either. Other fun things was the lack of return rollers on the tracks.
They just roll off the road wheels. What do you need return rollers for?
They would cause harmonic vibration within the tank, which would then lead to items being shaken loose all around the place, including your electrical systems. Again,
and your shillelagh missiles.
So everything would just come a little bit loose. Missiles could get stuck in the barrel sometimes. That's another fun one. If the gun was raised to the maximum elevation, the turret would automatically rotate to the left for no apparent reason. Now, I didn't confirm that one, but that was a fun little thing that one of the people who operated it commented on one of the videos.
Yeah, right.
So lots of people in the videos on YouTube, a lot of ex-drivers and gunners and loaders and so forth made a few comments about it.
Yep.
The driver's escape hatch. Driver did have an escape hatch out the belly of the tank, but that would be commonly armoured, plated over underneath because...
To stop the mines.
To stop the mines from blowing through the tank and setting it all on fire.
Yeah. I mean, the mine is the undersung enemy of the tank.
Which is why most tanks are now designed to be mine-proof.
Yeah, it's still a problem for tank design to worry about anything coming from below, but yeah.
Yeah. And it was expensive and complex in its design, leading to high maintenance and training costs because you have to have highly trained people to be able to maintain it. It was very maintainable though. Yeah. That was one of the very good points.
No, the power plant was solid.
Yeah.
And the tracks were solid. Basically everything was actually quite good until you got to the turret.
Oh.
And then that went to hell. You almost wonder if they shouldn't have ripped that faulty turret and faulty gun system out and put something else in. And because at the moment the US still doesn't have a air mobile tank capability.
Yeah, that's right. It was once the capability was not replaced once the tanks were retired in 1997, and so they no longer have an air deployable tank system. Even though the A-Team movie showed that they flew a tank out of the back of a plane, which I thought was absolutely cool.
I think they've done that in a Fast and Furious as well.
Don't care about that one. The A-Team movie was where it's at. That movie rocked. Love it. All right. Final thought from me that I want to throw out there that I read somewhere. I can't remember where. Sorry, but I took it to heart. Was there were a lot of good ideas that weren't compatible with each other in this tank.
Yeah. It's a really interesting one in that, for a start, when the Sheridan was used according to the doctrine it was designed to meet, it was incredibly useful. And I'm thinking the start of the Gulf War, I'm thinking Panama. When it, as with every light tank, when it was not used according to its doctrine, all its horrible faults were exposed.
Yep.
But also there were so very many issues where the designers just threw their failures onto the crew to rectify in a way that was completely unfair.
Especially, as you were saying before, it was a conscript army when this tank was introduced.
Yeah.
So you're expecting guys who've just done basic training and been sent through to Fort Knox to do their next 6 weeks worth of tank training to pick all this stuff up and know it by rote, and I guess you've only got the one job, one activity. And when they were deployed, because again it was cavalry, the idea of armoured cavalry was a fairly new idea in a lot of ways. You would just be thrown in the front of the tank and say, yeah, you're now the driver, here's your on-the-job training.
Yeah, and by the way, don't burn out the clutches because we've got a dodgy transmission that the dudes in Detroit couldn't be bothered fixing.
And don't drive over any landmines. Way to go. Good luck for your next 12 months in Vietnam.
Yeah. If any of the bad things happen, you're going to die. Sorry. Okay, thanks, bye.
And don't smoke around the tank.
Because we filled it full of uncased high explosives. Yeah, I mean, it's just... It's very upsetting talking about this tank.
Look, a lot of these problems they did fix over time, and as you say, when they was deployed correctly and with the support they were supposed to have, they were effective for the role that they were put into. Luckily enough, I think for everybody, that they weren't required to carry out their main objective, which was to be a light armoured vehicle in World War III in the bloody Fulda Gap, or being dropped behind enemy lines. And
to drop behind enemy lines is the real use of these.
Yeah, and run around and cause havoc in logistic lines of the Soviets.
But I have my doubts if an actual drop behind enemy lines would have realistically been possible, or if the Russian air defence systems would have just blown them all up while they're still in their planes. Which is the whole problem with air deployable troops in major conflicts.
You let the Russians do their initial advance and then drop them behind that, and so you cut off the initial advance. And
there's that, and you can use decoys, just decoys everywhere. But Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, folks, for listening to us. We're over the hour mark now. Rob, you're happy that we've discussed everything that needs to be discussed?
I think so.
Okay, good. And
It'd be fun to drive, though, wouldn't it?
yeah, well, like I said, second-hand market, mate. You know, we could still let's run our Patreon just to help. We're going to buy a tank.
GoFundMe. Let's help John and Rob buy a tank.
Yeah.
We don't need a tank.
Yes, we don't need a tank. But we don't. There's a lot of things we don't need. All right. Thank you very much for listening, folks. And
Take care, all. Wear
we'll
a mask. Get vaccinated.
Yes, we'll be back next month. Okay. Bye.